Very fun. I trust this is on. I can't tell. So, and I'm playing loud without it. At least that's what my family says. So it's okay. It's great to be with you. I have known your church from the beginning. I've grown up in this area. Actually grew up in Newport Beach and have watched all this stuff take place over the years. 10 years after this church formed, we started Tribuco Presbyterian Church just over the hill. And along the way, in fact, I was just reminded of a city here. About 2 months ago, I was in Sacramento and got to see Kathy and Chris Lovejoy. And many of you that have been in this church for some time know Kathy and Chris a little bit. And they had gone from this church to our church at Tribuco. And Kathy was our Christian education person for some time in the very beginning. And then they moved up to Sacramento where she is at work in their Presbyterian, and Chris is involved in youth ministry. It's really a wonderful thing to watch the legacy of churches, even fairly young churches like yourselves, that just keeps going. That the people that we have that come with us and are with us for a little bit of time, or maybe grow up here and move on, that as they do and they grow and they become a part of the body of Christ and they continue to use their ministries, it's remarkable to see the ripple effect of what's going on in the life of a church. And that ripple continues for you all. And wonderful to see Kathy and Chris, but more wonderful to know that the ministries that we're engaged in make a difference over a long period of time. I want to preach to you out of Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. And I think we're going to see. I think I've got this right. We're going to find out here in just a minute. It's a little. Gosh, I've got the wrong text in front of me. Let me. It's in here. It is verse 11. I copied a text and put it in. It's not the right one. So, but I know what it is. Luke, John, Acts. Isn't that nice to know that those up front don't know any better what's going on than you all? And maybe even less. Verse 11. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. We stayed there several days, and on the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. They had been told that there was a prayer meeting at the river. There was a gathering there of women, and they began to speak to them. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth in the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. And when she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my home." The Message by Eugene Peterson translates it this way: "If you believe that I'm in it with you, then come." They debated because they weren't sure. And after a little bit, they went home with Lydia. Verse 40 says this: after Paul and Silas got out of prison, they went to Lydia's house, and they met with the brothers and encouraged them, and then they left. Those are the only two times Lydia is mentioned in the Bible, and she's famous. She's famous not because she was a seller of purple cloth, which meant she was a pretty adept businesswoman and fairly wealthy. But what it means is she was in it with the apostles. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be in it? To be in this, whatever it was the apostles were into at that time. There was an article in the op-ed section of the LA Times a couple years ago, and it went like this. Every day the church is becoming more like the world that allegedly seeks to change. One of the people that looks at cultures, a guy by the name of Barna, and he was saying that there's very little difference between the culture outside the church and the culture in the church. And he quotes Ron Sider, who's been a a guy who's kind of radical discipleship stuff and paying attention to the church over a period of time. And in his book, The Scandal of the Gospel of the Evangelical Conscience, he says this: by their daily activity, most Christians regularly commit treason. With their mouths, they claim that Jesus is their Lord, but with their actions, they demonstrate their allegiance to money, sex, and personal fulfillment. How to explain the Grand Canyon-sized gap between principles outlined in the Gospels and the behavior of believers? Christians typically and rather lamely respond that shortcomings of the followers of Jesus are simply evidence of humanity's inherent sinfulness. But if one adheres to the principle of Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is the most likely, there is another more unsettling conclusion: that many people who call themselves Christians don't really believe deep down in the tenets of their faith. In other words, their actions reveal their true beliefs. I think that's right. I think that's right about you, and I think it's right about me. My actions reveal what I believe in and trust in and what I pay attention to. And I confess with my lips to be a follower of Jesus, and so many of my actions tell you just the opposite message. It's an unsettling thing to come to grips with as a Christian and as a pastor and as a human being, to realize how incongruent my life is and how far from being a true believer really looks like. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, it's a series of radio addresses, but he has one little section, one address that he made during World War II, and it's entitled, Let's Pretend, and this is what he says: God looks at you if you were a little Christ. Christ stands beside you to turn you into one. I dare say this idea of a divine make-believe sounds rather strange to me at first, but is it so strange really? Is not that how the higher thing always raises the lower? A mother teaches her baby to talk by talking to it as if it understood long before it really does. We treat our dogs as if they were almost human. That is why they really become almost human in the end. We have a cat, by the way, that's almost human in our house, which is actually quite a miracle, because the cats don't go that direction at all. They're not like dogs. But Bruce is the closest thing to a dog I've ever seen in a cat. So come to our house, it's a miracle house. But God speaks to us, God speaks to his children as if we understood long before we really do. Belief happens when we replace the stories we tell ourselves about the way things are with the truth of what God says this is the way things really are. Our life changes and the world changes when we actually begin to understand that God's not kidding, or that God's words are not idle or simply a bunch of nice ideas. That God's words are not only the truth empirically, but true experientially. They're true if we'll pay attention. We don't buy into a set of doctrines that we try to adhere to. The gospel is all about who, not what. James Bryan Smith wrote a series of books, and they all start off The Good and Beautiful, and the first one is called The Good and Beautiful God. Maybe you've heard about it. Maybe you've read them. And he does this thing that actually he adopts a methodology in the book that's not unlike one of our confessions in the Book of Order. We have a confession called the Barmen Confession, or the Barmen Declaration, that was put together by the church in Germany as it countered Hitler and the Nazi regime. And the pattern that they used was this. They talked about the false doctrine, and then they talked about true doctrine. And they would talk about the things that the Nazis were talking about as though they were true, and people that supported it. And then they would talk about the gospel truth and how different it was. And that's how they combated this early on in the life of Germany in the 30s. In this, Smith talks about it this way. He says we have false narratives, false stories about the way things are, and we have true stories about the way they are. Listen to a couple of them. The false narrative goes like this. Love and forgiveness are commodities that are exchanged for performance. God's love, acceptance, and forgiveness must be merited by right living. I get rewarded for what I do. That's not true according to the gospel. If I got what I deserved, isn't that Charlie Brown's little sister Sally at Christmas in the thing? She's writing out her list, and what does she say in the list? Charlie Brown's going. The list is miles long, and he's going, "Good grief, what are you doing, Sally?" And what does she say? She says, "I only want what I deserve. I only want my fair share." And hoping that's what her list, and Charlie Brown's just aghast at what she's doing. But isn't that it? We think that the exchange, that I get something for doing something right. Parents, school, jobs, friends, everything that we encounter all day long functions like that. I get the grade I deserve. I get the allowance I'm supposed to have because I took out the trash. I get because I do. And we keep training people that all the time. It's the lie of the serpent in the garden. If you gain knowledge, you can do what's right. Here's Jesus' narrative. Here's what he says. There's a little story in the Gospel of Matthew. It says, friend, he talks about the laborers in the field. And you know the story, don't you? The story goes like this. There's some people that started work early in the day when the sun came up, and they were agreed upon for a wage for the whole day. There's some people that joined in later in the day, and later in the morning, and they were assured that they would get a wage for the whole day. And it was the same as the people that started earlier. A little later on, late in the afternoon, when the day was almost over, the harvest still wasn't in, and so the owner of the field said, listen, I'll hire some more laborers, and I'll give you this wage. And it was the same wage that the people who started early in the morning were going to get. Well, the people at the end of the day were going, wait a minute, this isn't fair. We worked all day, and these people that started at the end, they're getting the same thing I am. It's not fair. And here's what Jesus says. Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? And the owner concludes with another cutting question. Are you envious because I'm generous? Isn't that an interesting statement? Are you envious because I'm generous? God is a generous God. God will give grace and riches to all kinds of people, not based upon merit, but based upon God's own generosity. God's a generous God, not a mean God. The rabbis had a similar story, but it ended like this. The owner explained that these people at the end of the day had earned the higher wage because they had earned it, that they had worked harder and produced more in a shorter amount of time than what those who started early did. Isn't that interesting? They twisted this, and Jesus was untwisting it. Jesus' point, God's grace is truly grace. It is extended to those who come over early or late. God's generous with God's love. It's easy to conceive of a God who is demanding, coercive, oppressive, condemning, wounding, and must be appeased. But the God Jesus proclaims is utterly generous. So listening to your prayer request this morning and thinking, I had a friend of mine come to me before Christmas. His wife, they've been going through infertility stuff. His wife had become pregnant, and the day before, she had lost the baby at about 6 weeks. And so early on, not unusual, but painful. And they'd been in this process for some time. And so I asked after his wife. I didn't know it had happened. And he said, well, that changes our conversation today. And went on about what had taken place. And he looked at me, and he's a pastor of church. He said, so how am I supposed to stand up on Sunday morning and talk about this good news of the gospel and how God overcomes all these things, but I am just devastated for my wife and for my family. And I just sat there for a little bit because it's such an awful thing to be in. And I looked at him and said, it's a lot easier to believe for others than for yourself, isn't it? And it's right. I can believe God's generosity for you, but do you believe it for yourself? Do you believe that no matter what you do or what you've done or where you've been or how you think or what activities you're involved in, that God's love overcomes anything you do? And do you receive that gratefully and live humbly in that knowledge, exuding that grace? Are you in this with Jesus, with the apostles, with Lydia? False narrative. I don't really belong in this. I don't belong in that group that people call Christian. If people really knew, the false narrative goes like this: if people really knew what I was like, they'd know I'm an outsider looking in. I'm not changed. I'm not different. I'm not like them. I don't act like them. I'm orphaned. Others look more like family than me. The false narrative just feels like I'm not part of it. I don't belong. I can't tell you how many people over the years have said to me, lightning will strike the church if I walk in the doors of the church. I don't fit there. It's like, well, okay, fine. Now let's talk about true things. And people would just go on and on about that stuff. Here's the true narrative. To all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of humankind, but of God. You may not feel you belong, but you do. There's a little book out. It's been out for some time now. It's called I'm Proud of You. A guy by the name of Tim Madigan wrote it. He was a reporter. Have any of you read it? I'm Proud of You. I'm sure it was on Oprah. It seems like an Oprah book. I don't know. It's a book about a guy who knew Fred Rogers. And it was about their knowledge of each other. They got to know each other in a reporting and a story. And they became friends. Fred Rogers did that pretty frequently. Became friends with this guy. And he began to tell Fred, Tim did, about his own failures and about his own potential divorce. And at the end of every letter that he wrote, Fred Rogers would write, I-P-O-Y, I'm proud of you. And he did that after he talked about all of his accomplishments and other things and all the professional things they talked about. But when he was talking about the failure of his marriage and the failure of him as a father and other things, Fred would continue to write at the bottom of every letter, I'm proud of you. And Madigan began to disbelieve it because his actions didn't match up. He didn't fit the description that Fred Rogers had. And so one day he asked him. And Fred just said, I truly am proud of you. That you're honest enough to share this information with me. That you're honest enough to be yourself. That's all God's asking for. God's not asking for your perfection. God's asking for you. Are you in this or not? Are you there before God as yourself or not? Another false narrative. We come to a communion table oftentimes. It's been whispered through the ages that God doesn't really love me, that I'm not important to God, that God doesn't care, that God is busy. that God's busy. It's often reported that way, that God has more important things to do than to worry about the things I worry about or worry about me. You may have read something or heard about Brennan Manning's life. Brennan Manning was is a Catholic priest, kind of radical priest. Probably shows up in a Paul Simon song, "Radical Priest Comes to Get Me Released." And he's one of those interesting authors and speakers. He's well known in kind of the Christian speaker circuit because he likes to shock people, and he is that way in how he presents himself. But he talks about an amazing story about how he got the name Brennan. While he was growing up, his best friend was named Ray. And the two of them did everything together. They bought a car together as teenagers. They double dated. They went to school together and so forth. They even enlisted in the army together. This would be during Vietnam. And went to boot together and finally fought on the front lines together. One night while sitting in a foxhole, Brennan was reminiscing about the old days in Brooklyn while Ray listened and ate a chocolate bar, and suddenly a live grenade came into the foxhole. Ray looked at Brennan, smiled, dropped his chocolate bar, and threw himself on the grenade. It exploded, killing Ray, but Brennan's life was spared. When Brennan became a priest, he was instructed to take on the name of a saint. He thought of his friend Ray Brennan, so he took on the name Brennan to replace his own. Years later, he went to visit Ray's mother in Brooklyn. They sat up late one night having tea when Brennan asked her, "Do you think Ray loved me?" And Mrs. Brennan got up off the couch and shouted, "Jesus Christ, what more could he have done for you?" And Brennan said that at that moment he experienced an epiphany. He imagined himself standing before the cross of Jesus wondering, does God really love me? And Jesus' mother Mary pointing to her son and saying, "Jesus Christ, what more could he have done for you?" What a poignant moment. What more? What more could be done for you and for me? The true narrative is this, that God is on our side. God is on the side of human beings. This is John 3:16, you all know. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Do you know John 3:17 just as well? For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. I remind everybody to read 3:17 as much as 3:16. For God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world. God came for us. God's not content thinking that some of us would reject the offer. God doesn't want anyone to reject the offer. God's on our side. In my work, I talk with people a lot about how to start churches. And the very place we begin is with this question: who is Jesus to you? I don't want your answer from the catechism. I don't want your answer from confessions. I don't want your pastor to give you the answer and you tell me what you learned at church to say. What I want to find out from you is, who is Jesus to you? So we ask people to actually write that down, and then we ask them to write it in language that's not churchy language. It can't have church insider language or Bible language or any of that. It's got to be language that anybody can approach. So we offered this to a group we were working with, and one of the guys, it was from Charlotte, North Carolina, great man, wonderful guy. He just said, I got it. He goes, at the end of a long day when I've been traveling a lot or working a lot, and I get home, and I am exhausted, Jesus is that queen-size bed that I fall into, and he holds me up. Isn't that great? Well, now think with this with me a little bit. What's the definition of faith? The truth of faith is this, that I pull the full weight of my existence into the hands of God, and God holds me up. What does he do when he falls into that bed? He puts the full weight of existence into the trusting arms of that bed, and it holds him up. What is he saying? I can rest. I can let go of this thing. I'm in this. He holds me up. I've talked about it this way. In recent years, my parents both passed away some time ago. My dad when I was in my 20s, my mom about 20 years ago. And you become aware that you're orphaned at that point, even though you're an older adult. And just in the last couple of years, I've been thinking about this question, who is Jesus to me? And I realized that when my mom died, my last true cheerleader died. My wife's not my cheerleader. There are times she roots for the other team. It's really true. That he'll get what's coming to him, because he deserves it. Sometimes she's on her own team. Fair enough. I don't probably deserve it. And so she's not it. My children are not they're 30 and 26. They're not my cheerleaders. They want me to do well so that there's a largesse that they get to share in. But my bottom line was, Mom was on my side no matter how I behaved. Really, truly. She ultimately wanted my best. She was always on that side. So when I talk about Jesus, Jesus is my cheerleader who wants me to do well in the same way that he wants you to do well. That Jesus is on our side, thick and thin, cheering us on. That's the true narrative. That's the true witness. So when Lydia says, I'm in this with you, she is saying to the apostles, I get it. I get this big love of God in Jesus Christ, and I'm in it. And I want other people to know it. And if you believe that of me, then come stay in my house. And they came and they stayed at her house. You want people to come and stay at this house? You want people to come and participate, not in this building, but in the life that you have as a family of God? Then my question to you today is, are you in this? Do you believe that Jesus is on your side? Do you believe he's there for you? And consequently, he's there for your neighbor. If you are, people will come and be with you being with Jesus. May that be the case, now and always.